for a lecture, Equality, Discrimination, Diversity, the French Predicament. Professor Daniel Sabag is senior researcher at Sciences Po Paris. He's a renowned specialist of anti-discrimination policies in France and the United States. He's the author, among numerous other publications, of Equality and Transparency, a strategic perspective on affirmative action in American law, published in 2007. And he also co-edited Qualifier le racisme, controverse et reconnaissance du fait racial, published in 2022. Just before telling about Professor Daniel Sabag, I think our Vice Provost Corinne would like to share a few words.
Just saying a word. Thank you for the students. Thank you for being here with us. All right, so, well, thank you very much, Sophie, for handing me the word. So, as Deputy Director in charge of student experience at the IUT, I would like to welcome you on behalf of our director, Azimunda, to this new session of Think and Act on equality and diversity, how to welcome differences without freezing identities. The International Women's Day on Saturday has recently reminded us of the huge gender inequalities still existing today. The gender pay gap in France remains significant, as you know. According to the National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies, women's average annual salary is 23.5% lower than men's. This disparity is partly due to differences in working hours. As you may know, women are more likely to work part-time. Today's discussion is not just going to be about gender equality, but about diversity and inclusion in a broader sense. Ethnic diversity, you know that. For instance, in 2021, 9.1% of employed individuals reported experiencing unequal treatment or discrimination in their current job, with sexism being the main reported reason. Disability inclusion. People with disabilities face significant challenges. Additionally, the unemployment rate among people with disabilities was 12% in 2023, higher than the national average. Sexual orientation. Bisexual individuals often experience marginalization, even within LGBTQ+ communities. They face unique challenges. In the USA, a 2023 study by the Williams Institute surveyed roughly 2,000 individuals and found that 17% reported experiencing workplace discrimination or harassment in the past year. These figures highlight the urgency to address all these issues. This is why I'm honored to introduce today's speakers who will help us discuss these issues. Daniel Sabag, thank you so much for being here with us. And Joël Kibitz, Vice President for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Université Paris-Cité, who works daily to translate principles into action and will share her experience in implementing inclusive policies. So a warm thank you to all of you. A warm thank you to Sophie, our chief organizer, and to you, the students, who will be the leaders and managers of tomorrow. And hopefully, we will think together about how to welcome differences without freezing identities and act for a more inclusive and egalitarian society. So let's get started. I wish you an enriching and inspiring afternoon. Thank you very much.
Okay, is the sound good for everyone? Okay, this is good. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. My talk today is entitled Equality, Discrimination, Diversity, the French Predicament. And my goal is going to be simply to highlight some of the distinctive features of the French predicament and try to account for them. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, but I have a text that I'm willing to share with anyone interested upon request. The first point I'm going to make is that in France, anti-discrimination law is less central and should be less central than in countries with lower levels of legal protection against job dismissals. It is logical that in France, anti-discrimination law is less important and less central than countries in which workers are less protected against job dismissals. And to see this, a simple comparison between the United States and France might be helpful. In the United States of America, basically until 1964, until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banning discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, and sex, the prevailing principle was employment at will. And employment at will simply meant that both the employer and the employee could enter into an employment relationship or terminate that employment relationship for whatever reason at whatever time. For a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all. So in the United States, this is still the law, aside from the exceptional regime of anti-discrimination law. What you have in the US is a set of exceptions, a set of exceptional criteria based on which it is legally prohibited to make decisions, race, color, religion, national origin, sex, and there are others that I'll get back to. But aside from that exceptional regime, what you have is an unrestricted, an unlimited employer freedom to make any decision conceivable. So are individuals protected against layoffs in the US? Yes, to some extent, but almost only qua members of specific groups. Groups defined based on this legislatively defined set of exceptional criteria that you're not allowed to take into account. Which means that if you are an employee that has been laid off, or if you are an unsuccessful job applicant and you're trying to raise a complaint, anti-discrimination law is in the United States the only game in town. It's the only weapon available. There is hardly any alternative. This is absolutely not so in France. In France, for better or worse, we have a particularly ambitious conception of equality, under which all differences of treatment that are unfavorable and arbitrary are illegal. All differences of treatment that are unfavorable and arbitrary, that is irrelevant, are illegal, at least in the employment. According to Article 1233 of the Code du Travail, it is forbidden to lay off someone without an actual and serious reason for doing so. So you can't fire someone simply because that's your fancy at will, as you say, in the United States. And this, in and of itself, is a protection against discrimination. And this is why initially many French legal scholars and many legal practitioners were not enthusiastic about promoting anti-discrimination law. And they were not enthusiastic about promoting anti-discrimination law because they thought that given this already existing legal regime protecting everyone against all types of arbitrary treatment, anti-discrimination law was basically useless or redundant. And this is partly in France why you have a distinctive tendency, which is the apparently never-ending proliferation of forbidden grounds, grounds based on which it is illegal to discriminate. If you, again, compare the US and France, in the US, under federal law, you have a total of 11 grounds based on which discrimination is illegal. Race, color, religion, sex, national origin, that's the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Then age, since 1967. Then, what else? Then pregnancy and bankruptcy since 1978. Then genetic information since 2008. Citizenship status since 26. Disability, I forgot, since 99, and most recently, sexual orientation, as a result not of a law, but of a Supreme Court decision, Bostock versus Clayton County in 2020, 11 in total. In France, the number of grounds based on which discrimination is legal is more than twice higher. It is currently 25. And that number includes physical appearance, union membership, place of residence, but also some pretty weird grounds by comparative standards, such as the ability to speak a foreign language, or some specific vulnerability resulting from one's economic predicament, end of quote. So what we have in France, which is a distinctive French development, is a tendency to universalize anti-discrimination law. Universalize anti-discrimination law and conflate anti-discrimination law with the other principle that we already had, a principle prohibiting all negative and arbitrary differences of treatment. And whether it is a good or a bad thing is clearly controversial. I happen to believe that it's not a good thing, and that it reflects not the legitimacy of anti-discrimination law, but a lack of awareness as to what the specific purpose or purposes of that law is. But of course, reasonable people may disagree. This is the first major distinctive feature of the French trajectory. The second one, I think, is how weak trust in the market is, and how legitimate, how unproblematic coercive forms of state regulation are, including within equality-oriented policy. States can legitimately intervene in equality-related policies in a way that would be blatantly illegitimate in the US even before Donald Trump. For example, contrary to what many people believe, in France, quotas are ubiquitous. There are quotas in public housing, there are quotas in radio broadcasting as a result of the Loi Toubon of 1996. 40% of songs aired on French radios, both public and private, have to be French-speaking. And there are also quotas within equality-related policies. The main example here being, of course, disability-related policies. As a result of the law enacted in 1987, all firms with 20 or more employees should ensure that the disabled should make up at least 6% of the workforce. And if they fail, they have to make a financial contribution to a specialized fund on a yearly basis. More predominantly, as all of you know, there are also gender-based quotas in one specific area, namely politics and the electoral arena. And this is, of course, the outcome of a long and complex history that I'm going to say a few words about. Initially, there was a law enacted in 1982, not a law, a bill, a legislative bill, setting up a 25% quota for women in political party lists of candidates for municipal elections. That bill was struck down by the Constitutional Council. It was struck down because it was held to violate Article 6 of the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man, according to which all citizens should enjoy equal access to public offices, quote, according to their ability and with no distinction other than that based on their virtues and talents, end of quote. And in the eyes of the Constitutional Council, the Constitution precluded any division of voters or candidates into separate categories, end of quote. So what we had at the beginning of the 1980s was a judicial decision affirming a principled refusal to acknowledge the existence within the French people of any collective entity. That decision was confirmed by other decisions. Which ones? For example, a 1991 decision affirming that there was no Corsican people within the French people, or a 1999 decision refusing to validate a law that had ratified the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages on the ground that in France there was no minority whatsoever, so no specific minority rights vis-à-vis language. As some of you and probably all of you know, this 1982 decision by the Constitutional Council triggered a new mobilization by the supporters of parité. The supporters of gender quotas, which were then called parité. And the main novelty was that the quota was increased from 25% to 50% and was reconceptualized as parity. Eventually, in 1999, a constitutional amendment was adopted, according to which the law favors the equal access of men and women to electoral mandates and elective functions. End of quote. This paved the way for a law enacted in 2000, under which party lists for all elections governed by the proportional representation system, namely municipal elections, but also regional elections, senatorial elections, European elections, all those elections governed by proportional representation. For them, party had to run lists with an equal number of male and female candidates. And for elections like legislative elections that are operating under a single-member majoritarian system, political parties had to run nationally lists of candidates, including an equal number of men and women. What would happen if they failed to do so? They would be liable to pay a financial penalty. And this is what most political parties chose to do at the end of the day. So for those legislative elections, parity does not operate as a strict gender-based quota. It operates as a financial incentive. Then, and that's the end of the parité story, in 2006, another law was enacted setting up a parity rule for corporate boards of directors. And again, the Constitutional Council stepped in and said this law is unconstitutional, which triggered yet another constitutional amendment in 2008, according to which the parité provision about electoral mandates and elective functions would also be valid for positions of social and professional responsibility, end quote. And so what we have now in France is a legal regime where promoting gender-based parité, both in politics and in corporate boards of directors, is a matter of constitutional law. And this officially constitutionally grounded goal of gender balance in key decision-making bodies, both in the economic sphere and in the political sphere, is also a distinctively French development. There is nothing of the kind in the United States or in most other countries, with some European exceptions. However, the way in which parité has been legitimized in France has made it more difficult for non-gender-based varieties of affirmative action to emerge. And by affirmative action here, I mean a policy which is redistributive, which is group-focused, and which is meant to counter some kind of structural disadvantage that some groups are facing. Parité, the way in which parité was defended made it more difficult for non-gender-based types of affirmative action to come to the fore. Why? Because the supporters of parité in the mid-1990s faced a ubiquitous slippery slope argument. What is a slippery slope argument? It is an argument according to which if you do A being, say, a policy proposal, then you will end up also doing B, and then C, and then D, and then Z at the end of the day. And you and I disagree about A. I think it's a good idea, you think it's a horrible idea, but you and I agree that Z, the predicament lying at the bottom of the slope, would be a disaster. So if I'm able to prove it to you that by doing A, we're going to be ending up doing Z as well, either for logical reasons or for political reasons, I've made a slippery slope argument against A. Now, what was the slippery slope argument vis-a-vis parité? The argument was simply that introducing gender-based quotas in politics would trigger a chain reaction at the end of which there would be other quotas based on grounds other than gender in areas other than politics, and that this would ultimately lead to an implosion of the Republican political community. Supporters of parité at this time could not afford to ignore this objection. They had to counter some disqualifying references that were then being made about the US model. The US model being supposedly characterized by quotas of all kinds, even though, as a matter of fact, quotas had been held to be unconstitutional in almost all cases by the US Supreme Court as early as 1978, namely 47 years ago. But this fact was not widely known, so the slippery slope argument using the US as a repellent reference point was quite effective, and supporters of parité had to counter that objection. What did they do to counter that objection? They emphasized that parité was not a quota, that parité was not even a kind of affirmative action at all. They emphasized the exceptional nature of the gender divide. They argued that sexual difference was a difference different from all other differences. They argued that, in particular, first, women were not a numerical minority. Women were not a specific marginalized community. Women were not an interest group. Women were half of humanity, as the prevailing cliche went. Second, a technical argument. We don't have statistical data broken down by race or religion in France, unlike in the US or Britain or Canada, but we do have statistical data broken down by sex/gender. Sex/gender is a variable décisive. Therefore, it is certainly possible to implement a gender-based affirmative action program, while it is not technically possible to implement a religion-based or race-based affirmative action program. And third, there was also a pseudo-anthropological argument drawing from the work of Françoise Héritier in particular, according to which the sexual duality of humankind, the basic division between men and women, was a structuring, universal feature of human societies. Therefore, a genuinely democratic and genuinely universalistic political regime should reflect gender balance. And in this very broad perspective, gender inequality in politics would not only or even primarily be bad for women, it would be bad for political legitimacy itself. Clearly, this distinctively French idea did not pave the way for a broader challenge to the Republican colorblind model. And this is a problem because we have empirical data showing that the level of discrimination, specifically race-based and religion-based, in France is relatively high. Specifically discrimination against Muslims or perceived Muslims. Here, let me start with a general observation. If we look at data comparatively, group inequality in employment is relatively large in France by comparative standards. For instance, in 2021, the unemployment rate of second-generation immigrants from Africa was 16%, while the unemployment rate of French citizens was 8%, a 1-to-2 ratio. In addition, only half of this 1-to-2 ratio can be accounted for by structural variables such as gender, age, place of residence, former training, education level, etc., which makes it likely that most of the remaining half is actually the outcome of discrimination. The problem, however, is that most empirical studies of discrimination up to pretty recently were not able to disentangle confounding factors, and they were not able to isolate the specific source of discrimination that they were uncovering. More specifically, they were not able to distinguish the effect of perceived ethnicity or perceived national origin from the effect of perceived religion. Why? Because in France, most Muslims are also North Africans, just like in the UK, most Muslims are South Asians, and in Germany, most Muslims are Turkish. So if people whose first name is Arabic sounding have less of a chance of getting an interview, is it because they're Arabic or because they're perceived as Muslim? Using field experiments based on names does not yield an answer to that question. And this is why some political scientists, both US and European, came up with a pretty ingenious research design. And here I'm using a reference to a book by David Lighton and his co-authors entitled Why Muslim Integration Fails in Christian Heritage Societies, Harvard U Press, 2015. They created 3 fictitious resumes. The first applicant was given a fictitious name, Marie Duke, a typically French and Christian sounding first name and a Senegalese last name. The second applicant was given the name Khadija Duke, a typically Muslim sounding first name and the same Senegalese sounding last name. The third applicant was Aurélie Ménard, a typical French first and last name with no religious connotation whatsoever. Resumes were strictly equivalent in all respects, but for the religious signals being sent. Half of the sample got the candidate pair of Marie Duke and Aurélie Ménard. The other half of the sample got the candidates pair of Khadija Duke and Aurélie Ménard. Why Aurélie Ménard? Because of course, if you as an employer get 2 equivalent resumes from Marie Duke and Adichie Duke, you will notice the existence of an experiment designed to find out whether you're discriminating, and this will not be a good idea from the point of view of the researcher. Hence, the need to indirectly compare what would happen to Khadija and Marie vis-à-vis getting an interview. And that study left no doubt as to the existence of a substantial degree of anti-Muslim discrimination in the French labor market. In fact, Khadija Duke was 2.5 times less likely to obtain an interview than her Christian counterparts with the same Senegalese-sounding name, Marie Duke. How can we account for this gap? One pretty reasonable answer is, well, racism and Islamophobia. And I'm not trying to deny that this is a very plausible answer. There is, however, another potential cause, which is that racial and religious discrimination in access to employment can also be fueled by the level of protection that employees have once they are employed. By which I mean that if an employer's freedom in firing matters is limited by the existing employment law, this may well shift the employer's tendency to discriminate to hiring, that is, to the domain of decision-making over which the employer has the greatest degree of discretion, the greatest degree of control. If you are an employer, and if you are operating in a high unemployment labor market in which there are far more qualified applicants than available positions, and if you know that it's going to be hard to fire anyone, you then have an incentive to avoid hiring employees that you're not comfortable with or that you think may be risky from whatever point of view. What are the employees that will seem risky to you from whatever point of view? Employees with fewer educational credentials to begin with, but also employees that are most unfamiliar to you, namely members of racial and religious minorities. So having uncovered this big gap does not tell us directly something about the strength of racism or Islamophobia in France. That gap is overwhelmed by racism and by other structural features of the French employment labor market. This is a structural problem, and this structural problem is compounded by technical, legal, procedural impediments to the effectiveness of anti-discrimination law. So I'm aware that this is getting technical, but this is important. What are those technical and procedural obstacles to the effectiveness of anti-discrimination law in France specifically? As some of you may know, in France, employment discrimination is subject to 2 distinct legal regimes. On one hand, since 1972, discrimination is a criminal offense. It's a criminal offense sanctioned by a maximum of 3 years of imprisonment and 45,000 euros in fines. That's one side of the equation. On the other hand, however, since 2001, discrimination is also a private injury liable for compensation through a civil action under a provision of the Labor Code, which now bans both direct and indirect discrimination. The criminal law avenue is a distinctive French development. You don't have that in the US. You have that in some Latin American countries. You have that in France. In the United States, it is absolutely not a criminal offense to discriminate based on race. It's only a civil injury. Why is discrimination based on race a criminal offense in law? It's mostly a side effect of an earlier fight against racist speech and anti-Semitic propaganda specifically. And if you look at the genesis of the 1972 law, initially it was exclusively focused on racist and anti-Semitic speech. The legislator added discriminating based on race and religion and access to goods and services as an afterthought. And this is why we have this feature of the French legal regime. But so far, this means that plaintiffs have a choice. They can use the civil law venue, they can use the criminal law venue, and up to now, most of them have chosen the criminal law venue. Why have they made that choice? They've made that choice because the rules of evidence are more favorable for the plaintiff in the criminal law venue than in the civil law venue, which is not the case in the US. In the US, if you are a plaintiff for discrimination in the civil law venue, you have access to documentary evidence which is in your adversary's hands, such as internal memoranda, personal files, etc. And you need that evidence in order to demonstrate that, for instance, you were told that the job was no longer vacant, but in fact it was, and some other applicant got it. How will you know that some other applicant got it if you don't have access to internal documents of the firm? You can't. But in France, under civil law, this is not the kind of evidence you can get. The only way of getting that evidence is going through the criminal law avenue. That's one reason why plaintiffs are basically congregating around the criminal law avenue. And the second one is that it's cheaper. If you raise a complaint under criminal law, there's going to be a state-funded investigation. And so you'll be able to take advantage of that state-funded investigation without having to hire at your expenses a private attorney. This is why there is this predominance up to now of criminal law as the main procedure through which plaintiffs are trying to make their case. But this has negative side effects. Why? First, obviously, all of you know that under criminal law, il n'est point de crime ou de délit sans intention de les commettre. There is no crime or misdemeanor without the intent to commit it. This is part and parcel of the criminal code. Meaning that if you want to establish discrimination under criminal law, you have to prove intent. And proving intent is not that easy. Because nowadays, employers who discriminate based on race or religion don't brag about it, or don't leave written evidence saying, I'm super happy of having fired this black guy. This is not what they do. So proving intent is not going to be easy, and proving intent is required under criminal law. And the second problem, of course, is that unintentional discrimination is quite widespread. We have a lot of empirical evidence showing that there is a lot of direct and indirect discrimination which is not intentional. That discrimination is illegal, even though it is not intentional. But if you focus on intent as a side effect of using the criminal law, you're going to be missing this non-intentional component of discrimination, which is probably big. Now let's move finally beyond anti-discrimination law proper, and let's look at affirmative action specifically. We already briefly discussed gender-based and disability-based types of affirmative actions. I'm going to concentrate on race-based and religion-based affirmative action. Of course, at first sight, there shouldn't be any policy of this kind in France. Why? Simply because, as all of you know, in France, unlike in the United States, the issue of whether state authorities ought to be colorblind, that is the issue of whether from the constitutionally grounded principle of equality, you can deduce a rule of color blindness, a rule according to which state authorities should not classify people based on race. That issue was not left open for the courts to decide. It was left open for the courts to decide in the United States, not so in France. That issue was settled And an answer to that question was incorporated into the text of the Constitution itself. According to Article 1 of the French Constitution of 1958, France ensures the equality of all citizens before the law without any distinction of origin, race, or religion. End quote. This obviously prohibits corrective, compensatory, remedial uses of race or origin by state authorities. One exception was made with respect to religion, an officious, not an official exception. What am I talking about? Between 1958 and 1960, in the midst of the Algerian War of Independence, the French state decided to set up, through ordonnance, that is, executive orders, a series of religion-based quotas for French Algerian-born Muslims to facilitate their access to selected components of the civil service. This was, of course, a last resort and unsuccessful attempt at legitimizing colonial order by co-opting a greater number of members of the subordinated group. That attempt was unsuccessful. The Constitutional Council was asked to rule on the constitutionality of those religion-based quotas, and it declined. There was never any Constitutional Council decision on the matter. And this confirms the existence of a causal link between violence or large-scale violence disruptive of the existing political order and the introduction of positive discrimination programs, a link that we also see in other contexts, such as the United States, but also South Africa, Northern Ireland, Malaysia, and there are other potential examples. So even in France, even in a case where it seemed impossible to begin with for legal reasons to have any kind of race-based or religion-based affirmative action, the only exception that we see is connected to the issue of public order. So what we have in France, which is a distinctive development, is the existence of a constitutional constraint of color blindness, the equivalent of which does not exist in the United States. In addition, we have a specific law enacted in 1978 prohibiting the collection and storage and use of sensitive data. What are sensitive data? Well, data about genetic information, data about disease, but also data revealing directly or indirectly the individual's racial or ethnic origin. This is a general prohibition. In that law of 1978, you have no less than 8 exceptions to this general ban. For example, when the data is collected by INSEE, or when the individual involved has consented explicitly in writing to the data being collected and stored, or when collecting the data is necessary within an investigation that's connected to judicial proceedings. Judicial proceedings meant to vindicate individual rights. Those are all matters of exception, but the existence of those exceptions is not widely known. And what you have in France, which is again, I think a distinctively French development, is a tendency not to make a distinction between 2 different types of using statistical data broken down by race and ethnicity. There are 2 ways of using statistics broken down by race and ethnicity. One is within social scientific surveys with no distributive consequence whatsoever on valuable goods and positions. The second way is for the state to set up a standardized ethno-racial nomenclature that is policy-oriented, and that is meant to shape the distribution of valuable goods and positions. It is possible to do the former while not doing the latter, but that possibility is not widely perceived in France. There is a tendency to assume that the moment you begin classifying people by race, you will necessarily end up discriminating based on race. And that tendency is again a distinctively French trend, the equivalent of which does not exist in the US, and I can prove it to you in the discussion if you're interested. So let me take an example about the French case, the Trajectoire et Origine survey, the first round of which took place in 2009. Initially, that survey, undertaken by INSEE and INED, was to include 2 questions on the respondent's skin color for the very first time. Question number 1, what color do you think people see you as? De quelle couleur pensez-vous que les autres vous voient? Question number 2, and you, what color would you say you are? Question number 2. Many things are interesting here. First, the existence of 2 distinct questions, which was meant to potentially disconnect color as self-ascribed from color as externally perceived. The order in which the questions were being asked was also interesting and noticeable. And finally, there was the option of checking the box, I don't know, checking the box, I refuse to answer. Those were potential answers. Despite all those precautionary moves, a petition was launched by a major anti-racist organization, SOS Racisme, that gained more than 100,000 signatures, including that of François Hollande, who was then the secrétaire of the Parti Socialiste, on his way to become the next French president, saying that this survey was like Adichie, was like French colonization, that this was unacceptable as a matter of principle, and this large-scale protest eventually was successful, as a result of which Identities backed off, and those questions were withdrawn from the questionnaires. I'm using this example as a way of proving to you that in France, the idea that you can classify people based on race is immediately intertwined, immediately bound up with the risk of discrimination based on race, in a way that is absolutely not found in other countries. So to conclude about indirect affirmative action and about the meaning of race in the US and in France. I think this difference in the legal regimes between France and the US reflects a broader difference in the public culture between France and the US. And by public culture, I mean the very meaning of race or race is actually different in both countries. In the United States nowadays, the notion of race, as some of you know, is ubiquitous. But the meaning of race is not identical to what it was, say, a century ago. When people talk about race in the US, they don't primarily or exclusively talk about a set of biologically grounded, unequal groups like Hitler would have talked about race. They primarily talk about race to identify a subset of social groups. Which social groups? Those who were most harmed by racist discrimination. This is not the meaning of the word race in France. If you actually try to study when you see the word race being used in France, the number of contexts in which the word is seen is relatively small. You'll see the word race being used by the most openly racist component of the extreme right, by historians and sociologists who are looking into the effect of racism, by lawmakers whenever they are banning distinction or discrimination based on race, and within some racist or homophobic slurs that are often against inserting colorful examples here. But aside from those 4 contexts, no one is talking about race the way everyone is talking about race in the United States. So what do we do if we cannot use the word? We use substitutes. We use euphemisms, such as diversity or ethnic. Like we pretend to have a debate about statistique ethnique, meaning actually statistique raciale. And diversity is interesting. Some people are now described as being issus de la diversité. This is a relatively recent development. 25 years ago, it was issu de l'immigration. Nobody was talking about diversité in France 25 years ago. Diversité became a dominant institutional role, first within the public sector, contrary to what many people believe. The police and the army were the first sites where promoting diversity was made into an institutional goal, then other components of the civil service, then large firms, then political parties, unions, and last but not least, the media. But diversity is actually mostly about non-whites and no one else. How do you know this? Look at politics. Has anybody hailed the victory of Nicolas Sarkozy in 2007 as evidence of the progress of diversity in politics? No, because Sarkozy is white, even though Sarkozy is a second-generation immigrant from Hungary. Has anybody hailed the fact that Hidalgo is currently the mayor of Paris as evidence of the progress of diversity? No, because Hidalgo is white, even though she's a first-generation immigrant from Spain. So clearly, in politics, diversity is about race exclusively. Also because there is another name for gender-related diversity, which is parity. So at the end of the day, the difference between the US and France is not a difference about the meaning of diversity, diversity. In both countries, diversity, diversity is more or less transparently primarily about race, with one major exception in France, which is that within large firms, if you look at the content of diversity promoting programs, they benefit mostly senior workers, women, and the disabled. They do not benefit members of racial and religious minorities. So that's one major exception. Aside from that exception, diversity is about race in both countries. The difference is that in the US, first you had an awareness that discrimination was a major public issue, then you had anti-discrimination policies being set up, and then eventually the notion of diversity came to the fore as some kind of post hoc rationalization for justifying policies that already existed and that were meant to counter the effects of race-based discrimination. In France, it's almost the opposite. There is no consensus on racial discrimination being a public issue of a large scale. There is no anti-discrimination policy worth of this name vis-a-vis race and religion, but you have a discourse celebrating diversity in the absence of the policies that this discourse was meant to legitimize in the United States of America. Conclusion of the conclusion, does it mean that there are just no policies operating so as to benefit members of racial minorities in France? No, it doesn't. There are such policies, but they are of the indirect affirmative action kind. What do I mean by indirect affirmative action? I mean policies that are superficially race-blind or religion-blind, but that are actually race-oriented or religion-oriented. They use proxies for race or religion. What proxies? Place-related proxies, education-related proxies, disadvantage-related proxies, class-related proxies. What do I have in mind? Zone d'éducation prioritaire, politique de la vie, or even the Sciences Po program introduced in 2001 as a way of benefiting students coming from high school that were located in a subset of Zone d'éducation prioritaire. Supposedly, there's no connection with race because zones d'éducation prioritaire are not delineated based on racial grounds. But those areas are nonetheless delineated based on the failure in high school, based on the proportion of foreign residents, and those criteria happen to be correlated with what people in the US would call race or ethnicity. And the same is true of urban development programs about zone franche and zone de renouvelation urbaine, etc. Those programs look at the tax base, look at people, how many people there are under 25, what's the proportion of university graduates, etc. But because second-generation African immigrants have higher birth rates and also lower rates of access to higher education, there is a statistical correlation between those colorblind criteria and race and ethnicity. So what you have is indirect affirmative action having a disproportionately positive impact on members of racial and religious minorities. However, those indirect affirmative action policies in France are mostly implicit. That is, policymakers are not going to be public about the racial dimension of their policy goals in most contexts. Unlike in the US you have tons of university administrators who, now that they cannot legally use direct affirmative action anymore, use indirect affirmative action policies in a relatively transparent way, because those policies are legally okay up to now. This is not so in France, and this makes a big difference. So to make a very long and complex story short, in the US and in France, over the last 25 years, you have a convergence around indirect affirmative action, but there is one big difference. Indirect affirmative action is mostly explicit in the United States. It is mostly implicit in France. What difference does it make? The difference it makes is that if indirect affirmative action is implicit. If you're not acknowledging the racial dimension of the goal that you're trying to promote, there is no way of assessing the effectiveness of indirect affirmative action. Assessing the effectiveness of a policy requires acknowledging what the goal of that policy is, at least once in a while, in some restricted circle. If that isn't done, there isn't going to be any studying whether the Sciences Po program is effective and to what extent in promoting ethno-racial diversity. And the second, and that's really my final comment, the second major consequence of this implicitness we see in the French policy regime is that this French policy regime is in fact internally inconsistent. And it is internally inconsistent once you begin considering at the same time employment, education, and housing. On one hand, in employment and access to selected institutions of higher education, you have an indirect affirmative action strategy using class and place as a proxy for race. In housing, however, and in policies about public housing, you have a policy of promoting urban mixity, namely ethno-racial mixity, avoiding patterns of concentration of minority members. This is not consistent. If you want place to be usable as an effective proxy for race, you need residential segregation. If you're trying to promote residential desegregation at the same time as you're using place as a proxy for race, you are predictably weakening the effectiveness of your indirect affirmative action programs. In short, you have a trade-off here. You can either choose to accept residential segregation, accept school segregation, and then use place as a proxy for race within the school program or ZEP or urban development strategies, or you can stick to a desegregationist agenda in public housing, but this will weaken your indirect affirmative action strategy. And what ought to be done, I do not know, but I know there is a trade-off here, the existence of which is not broadly perceived. I thank you for your attention and welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Daniel Sabak, for your very clear and rich presentation. I'm sure we have many questions here in our amphitheater or online. Annabelle or Vanessa, you have already questions in the chat, not yet? No. Okay, so So your presentation has shown how, so maybe the limits of the French colorblind policies, and also maybe the limits of the identity or non-colorblind policies in the US. Maybe can you give some examples? You mentioned other countries. Are there other countries maybe which do like a mix of both, or which choose a totally different path?
Yeah, I mostly stuck to the US and France comparison for lack of time, also because that's what I'm most knowledgeable about. But I think it is worth emphasizing that you have affirmative action policies in many countries these days. It's not at all a distinctively France, US affair. You had affirmative action programs in Nigeria, in Sri Lanka, in Britain, in Australia, in Canada, in Brazil, in India. What do those countries have in common? Most of them are former British colonies, not all of them. Not France, obviously, not Brazil, but most of those countries are former British colonies. So maybe there is an interesting development to be made about this historical connection between British imperialism and the existence of affirmative action nowadays. Having said that, affirmative action programs are very different from one another across countries, specifically with respect to which criteria are being used to identify the beneficiaries. It's race and gender in the US, it's caste in India, it's ethnicity or national origin in Malaysia, it's religion in Northern Ireland. So clearly you have a lot of diversity here as well. And maybe one thing I could say also about this diversity of affirmative action regimes is that the notion of diversity as a key argument, as a key justification, is not at all central in all cases. It is central in the US, it is central in France. So France and the US are quite similar to one another vis-a-vis the centrality of the notion of diversity as a way of thinking about affirmative action, as a way of justifying about affirmative action. This is absolutely not true, say, in South Africa, or in Malaysia, or in India. In those countries, no one is disputing the fact that affirmative action is transparently about remedying structural types of disadvantage. Is it effective or counterproductive as a way of remedying structural disadvantage? There are controversies, of course, but no one is pretending that affirmative action is there to promote some kind of valuable viewpoint diversity under the assumption that non-whites have a specific set of views and ideas and beliefs about the world that ought to be represented among the student body of selected institutions of education. In other words, this multiculturalist trend is highly perceptible in the US, also perceptible in France, not that perceptible in other countries which do have affirmative action, but in which no one is feeling the need to disguise that this policy is mostly about discrimination, disadvantage, stigma, and the legacy of oppression, and not about the virtues of viewpoint pluralism.
On the meaning of diversity, would you like to continue? In order not to take into consideration, in fact, the issue of race discrimination. So I think for you, as future citizens working in companies, it's also very important to be aware of the meaning of the words you might use or choose not to use because of the dual meaning. Maybe there are no questions.
In France, yes. Okay. Supposedly, that person could lodge a complaint in a court of law, but this is not going to be easy for someone who's not used to legal proceedings. The best thing to do would probably be to get something started with the Défenseur des droits. The Défenseur des droits being an administrative authority whose goal is to collect complaints for discrimination and then select those that have a chance of winning in a court of law. So that institution operates as a filter, and that institution will be able to tell you, given the evidence that you are telling us about, it seems that you're correct in believing that you were turned against in the legal sense, and we're willing to support you and help you make a case by, say, writing to the firm directly and saying, we have evidence that you might have been discriminating against Mr. X, and we are going to be setting up an inquiry if you don't provide us with information about why you did what you did. Or they will tell you, well, this isn't discrimination in the strict legal sense of the term, so there's nothing we can do. But that is probably what I would advise someone to do in the French predicament. Is that administrative authority well-funded and well-respected and super powerful within the state apparatus? No, probably not. But is it effective nonetheless in some cases? Yes. I'm a member of the scientific council of this administrative authority, so we meet once every 3 months, and we actually read hundreds of pages of evidence about cases like the case that might be set up by someone believing that he or she was discriminated against. And some of those cases have positive outcomes. Not a majority of them do, but some of them do. So that would be my advice. Thank you.
We know 30 minutes break, and we can come back for 3:30. So just before 3:30, we'll start at 3:30. Although online. Thank you very much. The color and more generally situation-blind approach. How can we create the conditions necessary for everyone, especially those who face discrimination, to exercise their rights on an equal footing with the others? How can we cultivate an awareness of differences not as inherent essences, but as experienced and inherited situations that constitute obstacles to exercise rights, to the exercise of rights, having in mind that disadvantages are often cumulative, as the concept of intersectionality so effectively highlights. So how can we make visible the biases that sometimes, despite our best intentions, lead us to discriminate or to overlook situations that should call for transforming a system designed for the dominant male, white, Christian, non-disabled group? How can we take action when confronted with behaviors or situations that, whether actively or passively, consciously or unconsciously, contravene the principles of equality? The aim of this roundtable is to further explore possible approaches by fostering a dialogue between the perspectives and experiences of professionals specializing in these issues, both within and beyond academia and across different European countries. So I sincerely thank our 3 panelists who have kindly agreed to dedicate their time to share their experience and open a discussion with you. So Professor Joël Kivitz, Vice President for Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at Université Paris-Cité. Joël Kivitz is Professor of Sociology and Public Health and holds a Gender and Health Prevention Chair at Université Paris-Cité. Thank you also to Dr. Fritzi-Marie Titzmann, who is Circle Alliance Manager at the Humboldt University. She has 15 years of research and teaching experience focusing on gender, media, and social movements in South Asia. Last but not least, many thanks also to Anna Trolling, who is Communication and Partnerships Manager at the House of European History in Brussels. And before joining this institution last January, Anna was EDNI Senior Advisor to the Director General for Communication and spokesperson of the European Parliament. So, to start with the first question, maybe Fritzi Marie, what are the specific challenges for EDNI in the academic field, and are there differences among the countries represented in Circle U? More specifically, maybe regarding the acceptation of differences and the representations of identities.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I mean, there are of course many difficulties and challenges in the academic field. And as you said in the introduction, I actually come from a research and teaching background, and only a year ago moved to a more administrative position in Circle U. And so I would just flag a few things that I think are equally challenges to students and teachers and admin staff as well. And I mean, first and foremost, these are unequal opportunities. And unequal opportunities we have, I think, in all countries, because in the past, certain groups had fewer chances to succeed in universities, didn't have access. And this still affects today's hiring, promotions, and access to education in general. So I think we start on unequal grounds. This already starts in primary school and leads up, of course, to the university level. I think more specific academic challenges are also the lack of diversity in teaching, because many universities still focus mainly on European or Western ideas and ignoring other perspectives. As you mentioned earlier, actually I come from a background in area studies with a focus on Asia and India specifically, and it's something that I have always encountered throughout my teaching life. Of course, we have also more social barriers or challenges, and these are unfriendly, microaggressive environments, small everyday acts of discrimination, and also lack of support that can make people feel excluded. And we have resistance to change from the leadership management level of universities, depending also a bit, of course, on political leanings, but also on national regulations and national programs. And if leadership doesn't commit to EDNI, progress is usually very, very small. And I think the last point in terms of challenges that I would make is to stress intersectionality, and this directly also refers to the theme of the event today, that people do have different experiences based on their multiple identity. Nobody is just one boxed identity. And so we have gender, we have race, we have disability. We heard about this in the previous talk as well. And this makes EDNI much more complex. And I think it's very relevant that we accept all these differences in identities, but it's a huge challenge because we don't have the structures yet, at least not in most countries, to address all these multiple identities at the same time and with the nuance and carefulness that I think it requires. So this is, I would start with this overall challenges, and of course, in the European University Alliance Circle U, of which Paris Cité and Humboldt University is a part as well. We have 9 different universities in 9 different countries, out of which 3 are not even part of the EU. So naturally, we have countries with unique histories, laws, and structures in terms of their EDNI policies and regulations. And there are huge differences. So, I mean, very broadly, one could say that we have 2 Scandinavian partners in Denmark and in Norway, and 1 UK partner in London. And I would say that the Scandinavian countries and the UK are a bit more advanced when it comes to measures and regulations and approaches to they have stronger support systems and maybe also a longer period of time where they could already gather expertise. And then we have, or maybe on the other end of the spectrum, we have, for example, the University of Belgrade in Circle U, which in Serbia, which is not part of the EU, and where universities also face very strong resistance to ED&I. And from my colleagues, I know that, for example, subjects like gender studies or anything that deals with minorities is not really well received or supported or funded. And so there's a lack of recognition, a lack of funding. So I would say that in this particular scenario of a European University Alliance, it's a huge chance to actually collaborate on such a theme as ED&I, because we really have some universities that can help by sharing best practices, and we can kind of mutually learn from each other. And maybe to make it a bit more visible, just a few examples. For example, in the UK, we have a race equality charter, which from my knowledge does not exist in most of the other countries of Circle U universities. We also have in the UK the Athena Swan Charter, which is a framework to support gender equality in higher education, and especially in STEM education, so in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, where departments can apply and they can receive bronze, silver, or gold awards based on their progress. And then in Scandinavia, in both Norway and Sweden, we have quota systems for gender balance in universities, which where in Norway at least 40% of either gender are required in university leadership positions and research funding boards. We also have quite strong LGBTQ inclusion policies and support networks, and a lot of support for first-generation students, for example, in Norway and Denmark. Whereas, since I represent a German university in Berlin, in Humboldt University, I would say we are kind of in the middle of these spectrums. And Germany has a very, very strong legacy in women's movement from the 70s and 80s. So there's a strong network of women's representatives in universities. And we also have a female professor program. And we have also mentoring schemes at Humboldt University for female scholars. What we don't have is very strong anti-racism policies, and like race and ethnic diversity is really not very stressed so far. And it's also, I would say, the overall approach in Germany is not very intersectional. We have an initiative, it's called Arbeiterkind, which means something like working class child, which again supports first generation students who come from working class backgrounds. But there's very little connection between these different programs that advance either gender or class. And I mean, recently there are a few programs now supporting refugee students, but they're really not very interconnected. So there's a lot to do, I would still say. And we've now just recently in Humboldt University, we had a structure for the women's representatives, and it's now been renamed and restructured, and it's now the Center for Equal Opportunities. So I think they try to now under one roof to combine diversity approaches, gender approaches, inclusion also in terms of disability. So I think that's quite a good step forward. So maybe that's just an overview because 9 universities, we could talk for a long time, but I think I stop here and give the word to the next question or next speaker.
Thank you very much, Pretty Mary. And I know it's very short. We only have 1 hour to discuss a very wide topic, but I mean, it's the first step. Maybe now turning on to Joël, what about the situation in France and more specifically at University of Paris?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I just want to make the student comfortable. You know that you can hear that English is not my first language.
So I will try to speak slowly, and after the round table, I hope you will feel comfortable to ask questions also in English, even if your English is not perfect, mine is not perfect. So that was the word before starting. Thank you, Freddy, for your introduction. I would say that Université Paris-Cité is also in the middle. So no, you know, we are not the best, we are not the worst. I don't know if there's a ranking, but we need to make a lot of efforts. I'm in this university for like 4 years now. It's a bit more than 2 years that it is president of Equality, Diversity, Inclusion. And what struck me when I arrived is this diversity. There are many different geographical locations. So the UT here, and the health faculty, which has a lot of different sites, hospital, and I go to other sites. So it's really diverse first. It's also diverse when we look at around us. You are different, okay? My students are different also. They are not like you. They are by age, by the way what they wear, they're wearing. And when you go to the university, you can see this difference. You can see this diversity. So yes, we are a university which is marked by this diversity. And still, it's not something that we talk about every day. It's there. We can see that. We can see the diversity, but maybe we don't talk so much about it. It's there. It's inside us, but we don't really talk about that. And well, maybe there is different reason for that. And I think that the conference that you had before by Daniel Savak gives some answers. I don't know if you know, there is a study on different universities a few years ago about discrimination. And it shows that, which is called Adichie, and on 4 universities, and it showed that actually half of the person working at university, not students, working at university, half of them said they faced some discrimination once in a work life at university. 1 person on 2 persons. So it's quite a lot. It's quite interesting when you go to this statistic. I don't have a statistic to show that, to see that actually, of course, there's a gender discrimination. And actually, that's the part that today in France and in university, we try to work, we try to study, we have some data, we can ask people about gender discrimination, inequality, violence, gender-based violence. So we have a lot of, we start to have documentation about it. But when it comes to race, it's a bit more difficult because, you know, Daniel Favart said it, we cannot ask people exactly the question. We can ask about how they are perceived by other people, how they think other people see them. And you have some questionnaires. And in this study, I can speak, they ask this question. And when you go to this person who say, well, I'm perceived as a Black person, Asian person, there were different categories. This person, the level of discrimination was higher, really higher, okay? So we have some clues that there's something not really right like this. So it's not our university, but it's different universities, and we can think that in our university, this discrimination are real. Maybe before giving the talk to the next speaker, what struck me too is that when you talk about gender and when you talk about disability in university, you have like legal framework. You have some recommendation. For example, gender equality in work, you have an equality plan. Tomorrow I have to present the equality plan of the university. So we have something, we have some recommendation, we have some, and also like I think in Germany, we have like a mentorship program, we have many action. That's the same for disability. When it comes to race, well, we try to do our best. We know there are something to do, We don't really know how to do it, but there are still some, we lack actually some recommendations. So of course, what Fritzi said that be inspired by other universities in other countries is really, really important. It's also interesting to go to the in the private sector to see how it goes, to be inspired by this. But yes, there is a lack of how do we act? And I think that we are working slowly, but we are working to do our best and to try to find a way to address this question and to be effective in the action that we propose. I have other things to say, but I will.
We can go on during the final discussion. Thank you. I just wanted to make clear, so when we speak of race, of course, not naturalizing race. So it's between quotation marks, and we could replace it with racial discrimination, just to be sure. Okay, so maybe now, Anna, what about ED&I in non-academic environments, and are these other differences with the academic world as presented by Joel and Fritzi? And also you have a long experience as ED&I advisor at the European Parliament. So what are the challenges to find a path that is acceptable for all Parliament colleagues from different countries or of different ages, etc.? So in other words, how to deal with different approaches?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sophie, for the kind invitation. I'm very humbled by the high academic level here. So just to say that I'm just a civil servant working at the European Parliament. So I'm not a politician. Can you hear me properly? Yes. Okay. The sound is working well. Thank you. Yeah, so I was working for 7 years as an advisor to the Director General for communication in the European Parliament. So this is not a political job, it's not political communication, but more press relations and communicating with citizens, etc. And it's a huge organization of some 800 staff. And just for, I think that what Fritzi and Joel said, there are many things that are very similar in the European Parliament administration. So the same challenges remain on collecting data on what you would like to call people who suffer racial discrimination or of different ethnic background. What we do have in the European Parliament since years is we work with action plans. So we have clear action plans for gender. We also have actually positive action schemes for people with disabilities. So we have a specific access to traineeships, stage, des stagiaires rémunérés for people with a disability. And then we also have a scheme offering a very limited number of one-year contracts, employment contracts every year for people with a disability, successful applicants that are competent for the job, of course. We have support groups and some awareness raising measures, and it starts to happen about ethnicity and race. We have a very good long-term cooperation with staff support group in the area of LGBTIQ. And we do have specific measures when it comes to, for example, adoption of a child or marriage rights and so on. We have had some specific actions also about religion, difference in religion. But the largest efforts and achievements have been in the area of binary gender equality. And it's funny because I did work on these topics a long time ago, some 20 years ago in the European Parliament internally. And it seems surreal to think now, but back then we had numerical targets for women in different levels of management. And we had targets like 25%, 30%, 40%. Why not 50? So we have to break our own barriers first, you know. If it's 50% of the population and more than 50% of the global staff, why can't we have immediately a numerical target of 50? So there was a political will in 2019 to set numerical targets to have 50% of women in management positions. And of course, by last year, this had been achieved for middle management and for director level. Now we only have the director general level to achieve as well. But this is also to say things are possible when you think out of the box and when you think a little bit further. I think that the most common obstacle we have in finding a path forward which is acceptable for all is that people generally think that the status quo, the current situation, is fair, that it's merit-based. I think Fritzi also mentioned this, because actually the current situation is that we exist in a structure which was designed by and for white men. It's a system which has a continuous affirmative positive action for white privileged men since centuries. So we mustn't think that we part from a point where things are normal and then we want, no, this is not normal. So this, I think, is the first step. And understanding that the system today is biased. And then I think that in terms of biases and raising awareness of structural biases, I would recommend a book which is almost 10 years old by Iris Bonnet from the Harvard University, which is called What Works. And she claims that there is no scientific or research evidence that, for example, bias awareness training works at all. And I find this quite liberating. This means we don't have to, because biases are based, they are like on the bottom of our iceberg of our consciousness, right? And the biases are shaped before we're 4 years old. So it's very liberating to think we don't have to change people's biases. We don't have, it's going to be impossible anyway. What we do have to be mindful of, I think, is that a homogeneous work environment that was structured, built and structured for and by white men, for example, is full of difficult, strange codes for a newcomer, for an outsider. And this can be quite intimidating and stressful. This is what Fritzi also mentioned, microaggressions. You're made to feel that you don't really belong. This can also happen to women in an academic environment, I would imagine, at a certain level. I will give you a concrete example. I had some years ago a trainee called Nina. She was of a European Congolese background. And I was working with her on a gender equality report, and we were discussing about the equality between men and women in the workplace. And she looked at me and she said, Anna, here in this environment, I don't even feel like a woman. Here, I only feel Black. So I think this was very good for me to understand that even, I mean, the gender equality policies, as they have been with the quotas or numerical targets or measures and so on, they were designed for white women, and they have not necessarily worked for women of color. And this is why we need to understand that we need to have an intersectional approach which recognizes multiple levels of identities. Just like, I'm just repeating what Fritzi said here, but in other words. So we've come to the same conclusion. And I think that it is very much the overall objective is to create an inclusive work environment, because you need to feel safe to be able to be yourself. So this is where we talked about the freezing identities. Is there somebody in the room who wants to ask something? I can see that there's.
Yes. The students are chatting and it's very noisy. So I mean, it's the acoustic of the amphitheater. Even one person is talking to his neighbor or her neighbor. But please go on.
I cannot see the students. Students,
No,
do you think I'm really boring?
I think that, no, it's very interesting. Please go on and we'll have the general discussion afterwards. Thank you, Anna.
Oh, I look forward to seeing them and to hearing the questions. So yeah, I would say that the objective must be to create an inclusive work environment and to redesign selection and recruitment processes to attract diverse job candidates. And in the European Parliament, we don't have numerical targets for ethnicity and race. We have carried out some staff surveys on these matters, and we have some policy measures, especially awareness raising, and we have a support group for racialized staff. But we have to remember that the EP is the European Parliament, sorry, was all white for a long time. And actually, in the first iteration of the questionnaire for this panel debate, there was a question about the EU member states. And earlier today, this morning, I had the opportunity to speak to the EU anti-racism coordinator. And she and her team, they work with the member states on anti-racism measures. And I asked her specifically, what is your opinion about the French colorblind approach? And she was very clear. So she can compare because she's working with a different member state. And in her view is that it is a very ineffective approach. And she said it's also a silencing mechanism. Because if you're colorblind, it's a way to negate the reality of those who experience racism and who experience discrimination daily. She herself said, if you don't see my color, you don't recognize my experience. It is almost like being gaslit. It's like victim blaming. It's like saying, if you feel discriminated, what did you do wrong? It's like with women when we say, you know, something happened to you. Well, what were you wearing? What did you do? Did you provoke this person to attack you? So this was the example that she was giving. And she said that being part of a marginalized community or a vulnerable group gives you a different kind of experience. Whereas the colorblind approach might have a good intention in saying we're all humans, we're all the same, but it actually shuts down the conversation. And I'll be happy to send later to you, Sophie, the link to the EU anti-racism action plan. And you will see how they phrase because they recommend to use data collection in the member states, but they recommend to do it in alignment with the applicable legislation and the fundamental rights. So you can see for yourself the solution between one approach and the other. And sorry, I'm being very, I'm speaking a lot here. So over to the next speaker, sorry.
No, it's very, very interesting. And I think you have a lot of experience. So it's very frustrating to have to interrupt your ideas, but I think we'll go forward during the general discussion. So maybe, Joël, to go on over what Anna has already mentioned, the main obstacles you face to ensure equity, diversity, and inclusion in your organization, and maybe also what are the main biases you are facing and how you can fight them.
Okay. I don't know about the biases. I prefer speaking about the levers for going. It's okay. No, when I was preparing the talk and roundtable, I was thinking, what can we say about university to take some action? And I think one of the best things we can do, and maybe the easiest thing we can do, we are a university, so what we can do best is teach. Maybe we can start teaching. We can start talking about it, but teaching. In our teaching, introducing like with gender, introducing the question of diversity. It seems maybe awkward in some discipline, but no. Actually, if we start also thinking diversity when we teach, I think we can make that, and I think it's a strong lever actually. We've also teaching or training which are focused on diversity or equality. There is, for example, a course which is open to all bachelor students about equality. So that's also something that we can do. We are a university, we have a teacher, we have the researchers, we have the students. So maybe you can start with that. I stop because students are talking. Okay, that's okay. No, it's for our speakers. They don't hear really well if you talk in the room. And I think the second thing we can do is like with what we do today, is to talk, debate, discuss, and to show and not to be afraid, to show what we can do not really well, and what we do quite well actually. Also to promote the initiative that works, and some initiative works. So I think that's also a major lever. And I forgot the question completely. So I don't know where yet.
Obstacles, behaviors, and level.
Okay. Obstacles, maybe it's us. We are the obstacle. We don't know how to talk about that. We don't know how to do it. I think it's the main obstacle. Of course, there is resistance. And we will find some person, administration, or teachers, or researchers who are resistant to change. Well, and so what? We can try. We can. So I think we need to have some confidence in talking about this question. That's really, and so the obstacle is maybe that we don't dare. We are afraid. We say, well, if I say that, if I go to this question, if I talk about race or racial discrimination, maybe I will have some negative reaction, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it will help. So I think we need to also to seek support in our researcher in the knowledge, and I think the knowledge is really a good helper and lever. What can I say? I look at a minute. Again, the thing that we do a few things in gender and also for inclusion and disability. Maybe we can also be inspired by these other domains that give some lead, some example, and I think that we can go also and to take some action to talk more about racial discrimination, because this is and we need to teach, we need to explain, we need to reassure. Because what we see, and that was the last part, but when, in the mission Égalité, Diversité, Inclusion at university, we also, we are a team and receive people, students, personnel, who sometimes feel discriminated, or they face some discrimination. Sometimes it's real, and there is a legal framework, and then about it. We say, well, of course, there is a discrimination, and sometimes there is a feeling. There are some student feels, personal people working here feel they are discriminated. And sometimes we need to talk about it. We need to say why, what is the discrimination, talking and explaining what is the discrimination and why we feel like this. And maybe it's right to feel like this. That's not a problem to feel like this. But maybe it's not the problem. It's not to say, well, to find to change the situation, but maybe to explain the environment where we live. I think that's quite important. So talking, teaching, discussing, and not to be afraid of doing that. I think that's really something important. I don't know about Fritzi and Anna.
Thank you very much, Joël. And maybe Fritzi Marie, you can go on with the theme of obstacles, barriers, and levels, more pragmatically and positively.
Yeah, I think a lot has been said already. I would maybe add, especially for this, for the political level, that is important for the European University Alliance, because it's an EU initiative, is that one really big obstacle that we face is a general shift towards right-wing politics in Europe and in the world. And right-wing politics usually limit any effort that has to do with ED&I. And so it's something that we will have to see also in the coming years how it develops, because we would actually need more of it and we are getting less of it. So it's kind of it's a big challenge, I think, overall for everybody working in like educational, political area. And then, I mean, biases are very, very, I mean, of course, there's a big variation. As I said, we have 9 member countries. It's Belgium, France, Germany, Denmark, Norway, the UK, Italy, Austria, and Serbia. So very diverse European countries. And of course, also with very diverse histories of immigration, for example, or gender or women's movement, etc. So I can only stress what I said earlier, that we face difficulties, of course, in aligning our approach. Like we developed a joint strategy in Circle U for equity, diversity, and inclusion, but it means we have to bring 9 different universities with 9 different national legislations under one roof, and to find also a good balance between measures on the level of the alliance and local initiatives that already exist or that need support. So it starts with very simple obstacles, because data collection, for example, is very different in all the 9 countries. Like in France and Germany, we are not even allowed to collect ethnical and racial data, whereas the UK has to. So, I mean, and this also results in different knowledge about the situation in the different countries. And then, of course, we have always an obstacle, which is the lack of political support and the lack of funding. But I think it's not very unique. But we discussed this a lot within the Alliance, and we kind of agreed that we focus for the beginning on measures and activities that we can carry out on the Alliance level. And this still means that we want to also include external stakeholders, like, for example, NGOs or organizations that fight for equal rights, but that we focus on the groups that are present in the universities, very much like Joelle, what you said. We have students, we have professors, we have academic staff, and we already have structures in all the 9 universities. Like, we have professors and staff that care about diversity, that have expertise, as we can see with this roundtable here. I mean, Joelle, we had met also earlier in a working group. So we have students and student groups that speak up for marginalized groups. And we also have university leaderships or leaders that care for equal rights. So we need to bring all of them on board. And I think we need to really reach all the different groups and connect them with a broader social framework. And I think then we can really, because we are big universities and we have a lot of staff and a lot of students. So if there's an awareness in these institutions, and if there's work being done, impactful work, it reaches a lot of people, and it can also radiate out into society. So as frustrating as it sometimes is, I like to really focus on the actions that we can take. And I think in this regard, we also use technology to some extent to kind of, to collect data, to analyze what we do and what we find, and also to make sure that hiring and funding decisions are fair. So we, for example, always have the possibility also with Erasmus funding, for example, to add social top-ups for students applying for Erasmus funds if they tick some of the boxes, for example, that they're first generation, or that they have care responsibilities, or they have a disability. So these kind of levers are already there, and I think we should use them. We should use all that is there. So yeah, I mean, in conclusion, I would say the best results come when all these groups work together and make use of all the things that we have and co-create more levers together.
Thank you very much, Fritzi. Maybe Anna, you would like to go on with levers. So you have already mentioned challenges and biases, but maybe you can stress now on levers and maybe allies in your action for more inclusivity and equity.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree with the previous speaker that the key, what's most crucial is to have your political and management support. And in my experience, when I was the advisor of the Director General, I had his trust and support, which allowed me to propose little actions, and he could see that when he would do them, he would get very positive feedback. And little by little, we became kind of a duo in this area, and it helped implement and mainstream actually a lot of actions. And above all, having the Director General sign off and send things out and state things and demand that now everybody in middle management should report on what efforts have been done on gender equality and diversity. It helped change how this topic was perceived. So suddenly it was not laughing stock anymore. It was something that you had to deliver on. So that really changed with the management support. And of course, like you said, funding, whether it's resources or working time, this is definitely needed. We cannot do D&I in our evening time or weekends. This must be part of job descriptions. This must be posts. And it's not always the case. And then allies. Yeah, to find allies, no matter where, in your workplace, in different units, different teams, different ages, different job profiles, and to build relationships and trust with them, and to support each other, to rally around the same objectives, to share information, and to help each other also. So this ally network idea, whether formal or informal, in my case, it has always been more useful when it's been informal networks. And I think what you said also, Joelle, talk and discuss, and also like one of you mentioned civil society, so consult also with civil society and listen and take part in those discussions. I think that's also crucial to understand what's at stake and what's going on. And then be concrete. Avoid big wishful statements, take concrete actions, and even if they are small steps, little by little, they will take us forward. So celebrate the boring work, the ants' work of changing rules, and the small steps are very important. And whatever you do, evaluate it. So collect the data for monthly or yearly reporting, because what gets measured gets done. If you don't measure what you do, it ends up being blah, blah. So accountability is key. And when you do that annual report, you present it to the higher authorities, whether it's your management or your political authorities, and you present it every year with hard facts, with data, with numbers, then you can see if things are evolving or not. Hey, students, I think the students want to talk now.
Thank you, Anna. It's very, very interesting. And I think, you're really concerned. And what Anna is suggesting here, you can develop it in your company later when you are employed in a company, or even maybe this year during your internship, like taking action as far as you can, of course. So I wanted to go on the same topic. You mentioned taking action, being concrete. So Anna, would you like to give us an example of an action you are proud of, even a small one, but something concrete? And then we will go with the other panelists, and we'll have only one last question, and then final discussion.
Sure. I drafted these gender inclusive communication guidelines some years ago. It was like my own initiative, and it was very homemade, but they established an intersectional approach, and they were adopted by the Director General, and they were very aspirational, but they became a game changer for driving change internally. And they referred to the communication with citizens, not so much internal communication. But it became a reference document that colleagues could point to when they wanted to be inclusive and fair and equal. And so that really made a difference, and that's when we started reporting on how we're doing with gender equality and inclusiveness in communication every year. So this was helpful. Another thing that I did together with colleagues, which I was happy to do, was that we actually did a small piece of qualitative research. The focus was always the communication, institutional communication of the European Parliament, but we set up online focus groups from 3 different marginalized communities, so people with a disability, or people of different ethnic and racial background, and people identifying as LGBTIQ, from 6 to 7 member states. So we had East, West, North, South of the European Union represented. And they were exposed to our European Parliament institutional communication assets, so posters, social media posts, videos, campaigns. And we asked them, what do you think of this? Can you identify with this? How does it make you feel, etc.? To find our blind spots, to see if we were doing inclusive communication or not. And it was, I mean, we wanted to find our blind spots. And what we learned was that the focus groups with the least trust in the European Union was the ones from ethnic minority background. And this was a big difference. Maybe, well, we also learned that in order to build trust with citizens from these groups, there must be tangible action from the European Union. So communication needs to be authentic, but it also needs to be underpinned by actions. And for example, there has been political, newsworthy political action to improve accessibility for disabled people in Europe, and to enforce LGBTIQ rights, and to enforce some anti-racism work at EU level. And I remember in specifically the focus group in France of ethnic origin, they had very low trust in institutions, very low trust in the European Union, with a difference to others. But there were some communication pieces which showed authentic youth groups working on common projects, social projects during the COVID pandemic. And they were from different ethnic backgrounds. And they rated these very, very positively. And they were expressing wonder at seeing young women with headscarves in official institutional communication. And they said this would never happen in France. So this is something I remember. And then we also learned that visual communication, pictures must be authentic and show real people. So even if we show diverse people of different skin color and background and abilities and disabilities, it's not enough, because the feedback was, these people are too young and beautiful. You need to show people of different ages, different body shape, different morphology, different level of conventional beauty for it to really be perceived as authentic.
Thank you very much, Anna. Maybe Fritzi, very shortly, and then Joël, an action you are proud of, and then we'll conclude with the last question.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, we are actually very proud to finally have an approved strategy for equity, diversity, and inclusion for the entire alliance. It was quite a lot of work, with which we can intensify our collaboration, and where we have like a basis for action and a basis for reporting, referring to what Anna just said, because we also acknowledge that without accountability, it's kind of pointless. And I'm really proud that we just closed our first call for so-called flagship initiatives in equity, diversity, and inclusion, where we received applications from all 9 partner universities, and it's a call that we will annually repeat, and it's open to staff, academics, and students. And each year we can select up to a minimum of 3 projects, depending on the budget that they apply for. And I'm currently reviewing the proposals. It's very exciting, and gives a lot of hope, because they're really, really good proposals. And I'm also proud, even though I haven't founded or organized it myself, that we have something called the Women Founders Network, which focuses on female entrepreneurship, at least in the beginning. And now they've opened up the network to actually to all genders and all people who don't feel welcome in the normative, white, heteronormative, male-dominated sphere of entrepreneurship. So they also focus on people who identify as queer or on other kinds of minorities. So I think it's a really cool and good initiative that also is a bridge between academia and the actual kind of career and work sphere for students, especially in the future. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fritzi. And you students, and also students online, I don't see you, but I invite you to look further on the CircleU website to find these initiatives. women's entrepreneur network is very interesting. So I think a call now for EDI is closed, but I think you can still sign in for the Women Entrepreneur program, which is or summer school or yeah. So.
Yeah, there are regular offers for students, for staff, and there's also a staff week on ED&I and entrepreneurship in Denmark in April. Yeah, so there's a lot of, and the Women Founders Network has a hackathon as well at the same time. So there's very exciting things you can find it all online.
Yeah, so this is an appointment kind of page. Okay, now try.
Okay, quickly, maybe really quickly, two projects. I've already mentioned the teaching course about equalities, which is open to all bachelor students. And they make really exciting projects about disability, gender-based violence, racial discrimination. So there is a lot of projects which are really interesting. So that's one project, and I'm quite proud of, because I have 40 students and we try to do an interesting thing. And maybe the second thing quickly, last spring, we did for the first time a communication campaign about for the International Day against LGBT plus phobia. We had a communication campaign with 3 posters. I don't know in English, but one of the title was Être soi la plus belle réussite. Maybe it's a bit naive. Some people say, well, it's naive, but people saw the communication campaign, so that was really a success. And then we try to be positive about this day. It's important also to be positive about this and to promote also these differences. So it was about gender identity, differences, gender identities, sexual orientations. But I see that Sophie doesn't know the campaign. Maybe you yes, okay. So big.
And so just the last question before you can ask your questions, very concrete again. As a student, citizen, or employee, what can we do to fight discriminations in our environment, whether we are victims or witnesses? So maybe Fritzi Mary, if you want to start?
Yeah, that's a few things. I mean, of course, speak up and report incidents to the right authorities and support those people affected by discrimination. So I would say the key word here is solidarity and not hiding, not being colorblind and not being gender blind. And I think it also comes back to what Joelle said in the beginning. It's crucial to educate ourselves and others about different forms of biases. This doesn't mean that we can eradicate our biases, but if we know them, it might be a little easier to handle. And yeah, we can always be allies, and we can also do small acts to create an inclusive environment in everyday interactions. We can be careful with our language, for example, and we can address discrimination when we do, as a student, for example, when we write papers, when we give responses, when we discuss things. And I mean, the list is much longer, but maybe these would be a few things that I would highlight.
Thank you very much. Joelle?
Yes, maybe just a few words about the reporting system that we have at university. If you are a victim or if you witness some discrimination, violence, harassment, you can contact this report team when you can talk to people. These people will listen to you, but if there is something about discrimination behavior or I don't know, violence facts, we help you to address the situation. So it's not only ideal mission, it's also human resources, preventive medicine, and campus life. So we have many people at university who can help you if you experience a difficult situation, if you feel discriminated, if you have just a question, or if you are a witness about a situation that, well, interrogated you, you just ask questions about that, you can contact us, and I think it's important to remind that.
And so, Anna, the last one.
Yes, just like Joelle said, there needs to be ambitious, clear and inclusive human resources policies and rules and regulation about discrimination, of course. And I think also about anti-harassment, there needs to be rules and practices. And it's a structural and collective responsibility. It's the university or the workplace that shall provide this. And managers should be made accountable, of course, for creating a safe environment. But as an individual, you can still do things to improve the working or the studying environment. I would say to be aware of your own privileges, to be open and interested towards others, to listen, to ask and listen to the answer while you're also being respectful. And remember that feeling safe is a precondition for being oneself or for being able to study or being able to work. So I would say not to consider, for example, comments or passive aggressiveness or attitudes as something that is not real harassment. It is also harassment. And I think that anti-harassment and being polite and respectful to each other, it's not pink fluff that we can have. It's nice to have. It's actually the foundation on which societies are built. So it comes back in a way to what we were taught, hopefully, by our parents when we were small. It's to be respectful to others and to understand their needs and to listen to how things make them feel, or to ask them about their experience.
Thank you very much, all three of you. So Anna, Prince Mary, and Joanne, for your time and good ideas to share. And now it's your turn, students, to ask your questions, and we'll maybe have also questions online in the chat. Not yet. So do you have questions? I will go. Question? I think you have to speak out loudly, because my voice is not working. Yes, this one is working. So, any question? You experience any situation where you didn't know what to do, or did it happen one time that you realized that you had biases, and then you changed your attitude? Or I don't know. Have you any question you can ask to our speaker? Personally, I've learned a lot about what we can do. Personally, I've learned a lot about what we can do at our university. I know it exists, but we always forget it. So please, I hope you noticed, you did know that we have this team where we can say we have been a witness of harassment or discrimination and be helped. I think it's very important to also to go to the website, to the CircleU website, to look further about the actions or teaching or whatever projects you can be part of. I'm sure you have questions. I mean, working in a company or, oh yes. So please speak out loud if you can. And if the speakers cannot hear you, we'll repeat it. Or come down if you want. Yes.
The joke and discrimination, because sometimes if you see the nation and people can still say that the joke wasn't very.
Very interesting question. What's the border between a joke and a discrimination? Because sometimes we receive like something negative, and then people say it was just a joke. And maybe also how to behave in this situation, because I think that's very important. Yes. So I don't know who of you want to answer.
Anna.
I would think that, I mean, if we should go by the European Parliament staff regulations definition, any behavior that is inappropriate, so that you have to define, and repetitive is harassment. So yes, it can be inappropriate jokes, jokes which refer to a person's look or physical appearance or voice or anything like that. I think we all know when we are joking and when we are being rude. We have to, you know, it's our own intention. And especially if you're in France and in Paris, you all have a similar cultural background, like you know the language, you know what's okay, what's not okay. Maybe here where we have people from 27 countries with speaking many languages, it's even more important. If I don't know that if my joke will be understood or not, I better not say it. I have to be respectful of the others, and I think I think we know our intention when we say something. We have to try to be kind. Kindness takes effort. Kindness, it's not stupid. Kindness is very important, especially in these times of extreme policies coming from the other side of the Atlantic. So I think this is something we can cultivate. And when I wanted to add to before, when we talked about discrimination or harassment situations, if we witness something, even if we don't dare to say, hey, what you're doing is not okay, you know, if we don't dare to do this, one technique that can be very effective is to walk very closely and like drop a cup of coffee or distract, but something that breaks the psychological atmosphere of tension. It can be very effective. I have a male friend who would say that he would see this guy at the bus stop in the evening harassing a lady. So what he did, he went up and talked to this guy non-stop. Oh, I wonder when the bus is coming. I wonder where it's going. Just to break the atmosphere without being confrontational. And same thing in a working situation. If you see a colleague being unpleasant to another one, you drop a paper or you fall on them, and then they have to stop the conversation. So this is just a tip.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I would like to add, maybe I was thinking of also this thing of daring or not daring, and maybe it's difficult, but having in mind that often the people who is being harassed, doesn't feel legitimate in saying it's not fair, it's not kind, and we have to dare to say it's not. So it's difficult, but we have to be more like used to think, yes, I'm not the one who is faulty, it's the other one. Or my neighbor is not the one who is faulty, it's the person who just said that is unfair. So yes, it's difficult, but we have to train, and maybe on the 24th of March, you'll have more practice on that, and I hope you will be there also on the 24th of March for our workshop. That's just for the people who are here in Paris, because it's not online and it's only in French, but well. The other questions?
So I didn't really understand the project about Mrs. Joël, and I would like to know more about it.
Which project?
About teaching the students.
Okay, thank you for asking. Yes, yes. So there is a teaching course which is called Égalité, Égalité, which is open to all students, bachelor level. It's not for master students, it's for bachelor students, so your level. And what we do is two parts. We have like a course, a normal course, magistrate course, where we talk about disability, racism, gender identities, and sexual orientations. So normal course, 2 hours, 4 times 2 hours. And then by group, because you are students coming from different faculties, different training, and we try to do some groups. We do some groups, and by groups, 5 students, 4 to 5 students, they work around the project. And the objective of this project is one of the thematics, so racism, disabilities, one you choose. You have to develop a project which aims is to raising awareness of all the students or people in university about this project. So, for example, what we had is students they created board game, yes, board game about LGBT phobia of LGBT plus phobia, and to ask questions. We had some students who developed some apps to measure their knowledge about legal framework on disability, what we need to do, this kind of thing. We had some students who have created some poster with some communication, and so we had very different kind of projects. What's interesting, they choose the topic and they work together. They don't know each other before coming to the teaching course, so they discover each other. They come from law, from psychology, from medicine. So we have also different students with different sensibilities. So, well, as a teacher, it's quite nice to have this teaching course. I hope I answered.
Do we have questions in the chat? Annabelle? No? So, yeah, do you have questions or remarks? No? Okay. So, thank you very much. It's Marie, Anna, and Joël for your time and
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much. Thank you. And good luck with the rest of the series.
so that, again,